one has that experience. The experience of the fundamental unity, the experience of the fundamental unity of reality, and they've processed it logically as theories that make sense of that unitive experience. They are then mandated and obligated to act to the rest of the world around them as if that was part of them, as if it was God in theistic forms of mysticism, as if it was no separate than them. That, in short words, is the ethics of mysticism, to treat all of reality as if it is not separate from yourself. I want to put a pause here because I'm about to complicate that statement and show why there's a very big issue with what I just said. But just to summarize, the ethic of mysticism, as I understand it very simply, is we treat ourselves one way and we treat things that are other than us a different way. And the mystical imperative, the chiyuv of mysticism, is to treat all things either as if they were us or as if they were God, and those two statements are generally one and the same for mystical traditions. For example, when the Torah says, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, the mystics say, not kamocha, like yourself, but kamocha as yourself, because it is yourself. Literally, kamocha is you. That's very short. That's the ethics of mysticism. Let us then complicate things. Mysticism, as we've been saying until now, transcends all boundaries, all dichotomies, all separations. These things all fall away until they don't exist, until there's only one and unity. Now, one of the very core differences, differentiations, separations that we have in everyday reality is the separation between good and evil, between just and unjust, between right and wrong. For the mystic, this category cannot hold because no separations, no antinomies, no opposites, no others can exist in the unity. The mystics reach a space which is beyond good and evil, is a phrase which is often used. Now, this is a very challenging issue because if you do not have right and wrong, if you don't have good and evil, then you don't have ethics. Ethics is the science of differentiating between good and evil. And therefore, if you have no good and evil, you have no ethics. And therefore, you cannot have mysticism and ethics. Let me quote a fantastic contemporary scholar on Jewish mysticism, a great philosopher in his own right. His name is Elliot Wolfson. I recommend reading his writing if you're willing to break your head on his words. Elliot Wolfson writes, if mystical experience embraces a form of non-dual consciousness, a state of mind which has no duality, which has no otherness, then in such a state of mind, the regulative dichotomy, so basic to ethical discernment, would seem to be transcended, and the very foundation for ethical decisions undermined. The very categories of wrong and right, which are needed to have any ethical question, are transcended by the mystic, who sees no separation, no otherness, no dualities. And therefore, ethics itself is undermined. To prefer this or that between possible acts, which is what ethics is, choosing between things, it is necessary to have a distinction between good and evil, or at least between better and worse. But this distinction, like every pertaining to action, belongs to what the mystics regard as the world of illusion. Only in the world of illusion is there distinction, is there better, is there worse, is there good and the bad. In the space of truth, there's no otherness, therefore there can be no ethics. I'd like to just make a small case here for the importance of beliefs, the importance of metaphysics. And I think there's much truth to that it is the narratives that we frame around our reality which shape how we choose to behave, both personally, interpersonally, ethically, politically. And therefore, I think these questions are real questions and are pressing questions and important questions. And particularly, I think, in a day and age where we see so much trouble and so much chaos and so much destruction around us, it demands for us to re-examine our basic premises, our basic metaphysical premises and narratives that lead and guide our behavior. And with that, I'd like to introduce two models for ethics from Jewish thought, from Jewish literature, which we can use to both understand the theory and the practice here, and perhaps will give us a way of solving this issue which we've posed here. Those two models, they come from two trees. Perhaps the most famous tree or trees in the Bible are the trees in the very, very first page in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, where God creates Adam and Eve, and he tells them, this one tree you see here, don't you dare eat from this one. This other tree, eat from it as much as you want. Gesundheit. That is how the biblical story begins. And Adam and Eve go, and of course they eat from the tree, which they're not supposed to. And that is how we get our reality as it is. They leave the garden, they're in exile. And so much of the Jewish mystical tradition and Christian Muslim that share these sacred texts try to wrap their heads around understanding what these texts mean metaphysically, psychologically, spiritually, and mystically. One of the key ways which these texts have been read is that there are two paradigms of ethics embodied by these two trees. And what better than to use a metaphor from nature itself, a place which needs our ethical vision. There is the tree of good and evil, the Eitz Das Tov Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is the tree which they eat from, which they're not supposed to eat from. And then there is the Eitz HaChaim, there's the tree of life. These are the two trees. And these, I think, also represent two models of ethics. There is a form of ethics which is based on justice, which needs a very clear distinction. There needs to be das, there needs to be knowledge about what is tov and what is ra, what is good and what is bad. And we need to think very hard about differentiating between what is good and what is bad. And in ethics, many, many pages and pages of ink have been spilled to try and create systems to differentiate between good and evil in deontology and utilitarian and all forms of ethics to try to explain what is good, what is evil. A lot of religious literature to try and figure out what is just. That is one form of ethics, which is based on justice. The other form of ethics is the Eitz HaChaim, the Eitz HaChaim, which is the tree of life, where in that there is no distinction, there is no separation between good and evil. The mystics see it as a messianic tree. It's the tree of the end of days. It's the return to paradise. It's the tree of innocence, of childhood, where we don't know wrong and we don't know right. All we know is love. We can see all of reality, every person, every animal, and every part of nature as part of ourselves, and therefore our own concern for others becomes our concern for ourselves because they are one and the same. And that is the ethics of love, not an ethics of justice. That those two trees represent two paradigms of reality going forward. The tree of knowledge is the knowledge of good and evil, is the knowledge that there are otherness, there is separation, there is right and there is wrong, there is ethics, there's just and there's unjust, there's punishment, and that is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is the one which is eaten from, which is what becomes the model for our reality. Right? We live right now in a tree of knowledge reality because of that original sin, to borrow our neighbor's language. It's the tree of life, which in life and in the true perspective of reality, good and evil fade away, where all that is the happening of reality as it is, and the very judgments, the very separations, the very labels of right and wrong, good and bad become inapplicable. They become subsumed. They become lost in that space of true life. Where, for perhaps to use the symbol of the yin yang, someone here mentioned Taoism earlier, where the good is in the bad is in the good, because that is what life is. Life is not able to separate between those two things. But the way that life nourishes, the way that life flourishes, the way that life continues is that life functions as an organism, as one large system. The way that nature works is nature does not work in separate things where everything in nature has its own separate bank account, its own separate. Nature is one big living organism. And that is what life is. And in nature, is there good and bad? When the gazelle is eaten by the lion, is that bad? Is the lion malicious in doing that? That is life. But when life is built on a foundation of love, as we in Judaism believe the world is, and as the mystics across traditions believe the world is, because they experience, in the most fundamental experience of reality, they experience love. When we can predicate our existence on love, and love for the mystic means a total identification with all of existence, that is the space where we can reinsert our ethical imperative, not in a way, by the way, that's even an imperative. There's a very interesting phrase in the Talmud, which says that mitzvot betelot la'atid lavo, that when in the end of days, in the eschatological messianic period, there will be no more mitzvot. A very troubling phase, which many great halachic figures grappled with very difficulty. The mystics had no problem, because the mystics say that in that space, in that messianic place, in that place of unity and love, in the messianic place of the tree of life, there is no longer a need to command. There's no longer a tzivui, the mitzvah, the commandment falls away, because you don't need to command me to be good to myself, to take care of myself, to feed myself. If we lived in that true reality, in that messianic reality, in the most blissful reality, we would not physically be able to feed ourselves an extra morsel of food before everyone in our vicinity was fed and clothed and bathed and taken care of. It would be physically impossible, and it wouldn't take a commandment. It wouldn't take an imperative. It wouldn't even take a chiyuv, which is why that now we need a chiyuv. But when Mashiach comes in the end of days, it's batel. There's mitzvot betelot. We don't even be told to do that. It's the same way that we love and care for ourselves is the same way we love and care for all of existence. There's such a beautiful line from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, who we lost so recently. He said that the test of faith is whether one can make room for difference, whether I can recognize God's image in someone who is not in my own image, in my own language, my own faith, my own ideals. Because if I can only recognize God's image in someone that looks like me, talks like me, thinks like me, I'm not recognizing God's image, I'm recognizing my own image. Because I can the more distant someone is, the more different someone is, of another persuasion, another color, the more you're able to recognize the divinity still there, that means that you're truly seeing yourself and them in God's image and not just your own image. And that's such a radical challenging notion. I also a brilliant quote I think is so appropriate for this moment. It's from a Christian mystic, William Blake, who some may know. He was a brilliant poet and visionary, an artist, and just a madman and a beautiful soul, who poured forth so much light into the world. On a point which I think may combine both of these topics of how can we know and the ethics involved, he writes like this. And this is so William Blake, it's fantastic. He writes, "The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel dined with me. They came to my house for Shabbos when they dined with me. And I asked them how they dared so roundly to assert that God spoke to them, and whether they did not think at the time that they should be misunderstood and be the cause of so much imposition. Like, what chutzpah do you have to say that God spoke to you? Are you kidding me?" and to say those words to the public, like even if you believe that, how many people take that in generations to come? And William Blake says, Isaiah answered, "I saw no God, nor heard any in a finite organic perception, but my senses discovered the infinite in everything. And I was then persuaded and remain confirmed that the voice of honest indignation is the voice of God. I cared not for consequences but wrote." And I think that so beautifully ties together these two questions of can we know and how do we act, where the prophet Isaiah, and this is so true to the prophet, the fact that William Blake intuited this from the prophet Isaiah itself is prophetic, where the prophets experienced in the everything, they experienced the divine, and they were persuaded by their righteous indignation. How can the prophet, there's this old debate in the philosophy of mysticism, were the prophets mystics, were the prophets not mystics? It's such a silly debate because the prophet so clearly experienced the divine in the present, in the other, in the self, that when they saw the poor, the downtrodden, the marginalized, the beaten, the widow, the foreigner being persecuted, they said, "How can you? That is you, that is God." And the prophets came out in righteous indignation. And whether they knew their theology or they didn't, Isaiah says, according to him, like, "I saw no God, but I heard that voice. I heard that called Mama Daka, which compelled me and commanded me to write without the care of consequence." I want to end, if I may, with two very, very short quotes. One of them from two very different people. One of them was from Aaron Schwartz, who was born in 1986, and he committed suicide in 2013. He was being persecuted by the FBI for piracy because he was trying to take information that was being kept behind paywalls and make it free to the public as part of a free information movement. And he's become a martyr for that movement in many ways, a very beautiful soul, a beautiful spirit. And he said that because I had believed for so long that change was impossible, it precluded me from taking any actions that could have caused that change. And it was only once he realized that change was a possibility that he was able to be unparalyzed. He died at the age of 27, such a young age. But once he realized that change was possible, then he was able to take action. And I think that's such an empowering message to have. And I'd like to end with one final one about what our change perhaps can look like based on our conversation, with a line from a very different person, from Mother Teresa, who said, "We cannot do any great things. We can only do small things with great love." And I think that it's so important. It's not about doing great monumentous things. It's not about doing things that are going to get us written up in the New York Magazine. It's not about winning the Nobel Prize. It's about doing small things with huge, with immense, with shattering love. And it is those things which will create a more beautiful messianic world for all of us.